The Valorans were a small species. Their bodies were thin and delicate, and their skin glowed with soft blue light that changed color when they felt strong emotions. They came from a world called Keth 7, a planet that was always half in darkness and half in light because it never turned away from its twin suns. For 3,000 years, the Valorans had been members of the Galactic Assembly. They were not warriors. They were not conquerors. They were keepers of knowledge. Their great libraries held the history of 10,000 civilizations. They recorded everything, forgot nothing, and harmed no one. Every species in the galaxy respected them, even if they did not fear them. The Valorans had no army. They had never needed one. When the Hollow Swarm came, it came without warning. The swarm was not a species. It was a machine intelligence. Billions upon billions of metal creatures that moved through space like locusts through a field of grain. No one knew who had built them or why. Some said they were weapons from a war that had ended 1,000,000 years ago. Others said they were miners that had gone mad. It did not matter what they had been. What mattered was what they were now. Hungry, endless, and completely without mercy. They appeared first at the edge of Valorian space, near the outer colonies where miners and farmers lived simple lives among the asteroids. Within 3 days, those colonies were gone. Not conquered, not occupied, simply gone. The swarm did not take prisoners. It did not make demands. It consumed everything in its path and moved on. Ambassador Salathorn watched the reports come in from her office on the assembly station called Nexus Prime. She was old for a Valorian. Nearly 400 years, and she had spent most of her life believing that the galaxy was a place of reason and order. The assembly existed to protect its members. That was its purpose. That was its promise. She requested an emergency session of the Grand Chamber. The Grand Chamber of the Galactic Assembly was the largest enclosed space ever built by intelligent beings. Its ceiling rose so high that clouds sometimes formed beneath it. Thousands of platforms floated in the air, each one holding the delegation of a different species. The Krethvok, massive reptilian warriors who ruled over 200 star systems, sat near the center. The Syndicate of Orionis, a collective of merchant species who controlled most of the galaxy's trade, occupied a platform covered in glowing screens. The Elder Conclave of the Mirthen, ancient beings who had been traveling between stars when most species were still learning to use fire, hovered in their environmental pods near the top of the chamber. Salathorn stood on the Valorian platform and looked up at all of them. Her body flickered with pale yellow light, the color of fear and desperation. She spoke for 1 hour. She showed them images of the destroyed colonies. She showed them the size of the swarm, a cloud of metal that stretched across light years of space. She showed them projections of where it would go next, through Valorian space, and then onward to the territories of other assembly members. She asked, begged, pleaded for help. The Krethvok ambassador spoke first. His voice was deep and rumbling, like stones grinding together. He expressed sympathy for the Valorian situation. He noted that the Krethvok military was currently engaged in border disputes on the far side of their territory. He regretted that they could not spare any ships at this time. He abstained from the vote. The Syndicate of Orionis spoke next. Their representative was a small, multi-limbed creature covered in jewelry. It explained that military intervention was economically non-viable. The cost of fighting the swarm would exceed the value of Valorian space by a factor of 12. The Syndicate voted against intervention. The Mirthen did not speak at all. In the middle of Salathorn's presentation, they simply turned off their translation devices. When the vote came, they were silent. One by one, the great powers of the galaxy offered their responses. Some were polite. Some were cold. Some pretended to care. None of them offered help. When the final count was announced, the result was clear. The Galactic Assembly had officially classified the Hollow Swarm incursion as an internal Valorian matter. This meant that no member species was obligated to assist. This meant that the Valorians were on their own. Salathorn stood on her platform as the other delegations began to leave. The Krethvok were already discussing their dinner plans. The Orionis merchants were calculating new trade routes that would avoid the conflict zone. The Mir then had simply vanished, as they often did when things became unpleasant. No one looked at her. No one said goodbye. In the observation gallery above the chamber, a human woman watched everything. Her name was Commander Elena Vasquez, and she was part of Earth's small diplomatic team on Nexus Prime. Humanity had only been a member of the Assembly for 47 years. In galactic terms, they were children, newcomers who had barely learned to walk among the stars. Vasquez was not supposed to be in the gallery. She had no official business there. But she had heard rumors about the emergency session, and she had wanted to see for herself how the great powers of the galaxy handled a crisis. Now she knew. She watched Salathorn stand alone on her platform, her body flickering with colors that needed no translation. Grief, despair, and the beginning of acceptance. The Valorian ambassador was realizing that her people were going to die, and that no one in the galaxy cared enough to stop it. Vasquez pulled out her communication device and opened a secure channel to Earth. The message would take several hours to reach the United Earth Council, but she sent it anyway. "They are going to let them burn," she said quietly. "The Assembly is going to stand by and watch an entire species die because helping them is too expensive, too risky, or too inconvenient. I know we are small. I know we cannot afford to make enemies. But I am asking you to consider what kind of species we want to be. Do we want to be like them?" She closed the channel and looked back down at the chamber. Salathorn had finally left her platform. The lights were dimming. The greatest governing body in the galaxy had just signed the death warrant of a peaceful species, and now everyone was going home to sleep well in their comfortable beds. Vasquez did not sleep that night. She stayed in her quarters, staring at the stars, and wondered if anyone on Earth was listening. Somewhere in the darkness between those stars, the Hollow Swarm continued its advance. It did not know about the Assembly's vote. It did not care about politics or economics or ancient alliances. It only knew how to consume, and it was very, very good at its purpose. The Valorians had perhaps 6 months before it reached their homeworld. After that, there would be nothing left to save. The message from Commander Vasquez reached Earth 14 hours after she sent it. It passed through 3 relay stations, was decoded by military intelligence, flagged as urgent, and delivered directly to the United Earth Council. The council met in Geneva, in a building that had once housed the old United Nations. The room was simple compared to the grand chamber of the Assembly. There were no floating platforms, no clouds beneath the ceiling, no representatives of ancient species. There were just 53 men and women sitting around a curved table, looking at screens that showed the dying colonies of a species most of them had never heard of. Amaro Marcus Chen sat near the end of the table. He was 62 years old, with gray hair cut short and a face that had seen too many battles. He had commanded Earth's first expedition beyond the solar system. He had fought in the border war against the Syndicate pirates. He had buried more friends than he could count. He listened as the intelligence officers explained the situation. The Valorians were a minor species with no strategic value. Their space was far from Earth's territory. The Hollow Swarm was a threat that no single fleet could defeat. The Assembly had already decided not to intervene. If humanity acted alone, they would be violating Assembly protocols, making enemies of the great powers, and sending their ships into a fight they could not win. The logical choice was obvious. Earth should do nothing. Earth should wait. Earth should let the Valorans die and hope that the swarm burned itself out before it reached human space. For 2 hours, Chun listened to logical arguments from logical people. They talked about resource allocation and diplomatic consequences and acceptable losses. They used words like regrettable and unfortunate, and outside our sphere of responsibility. Then the intelligence officer put up the latest images from Valorian. Spaced out the images showed evacuation ships. Thousands of them, civilian transports that were never designed for emergencies, packed with refugees fleeing the outer colonies. The ships were heading toward the inner system, toward Keth 7, but there was nowhere for them to go. The swarm was coming, and soon there would be no inner system left. One image showed the inside of a transport ship. Valorian families huddled together in cargo holds. Children clung to their parents, their skin flickering with colors of fear. They were small and fragile and completely helpless. Chun stood up. The room went quiet. An admiral standing during a council session was unusual. An admiral standing without being recognized was almost unheard of. "I have heard enough," Chun said. His voice was calm, but there was something hard beneath it. "You have spent 2 hours explaining why we cannot help these people. You have given me numbers and projections and risk assessments. Now let me give you something." He touched his screen and a new image appeared. It was a photograph from Earth's history, black and white, showing a city reduced to rubble. Smoke rose from collapsed buildings. Bodies lay in the streets. "This is Warsaw," Chun said. 1944, Earth's Second World War. The people of this city rose up against the army that occupied them. They fought for 63 days. They asked for help from the armies that were supposed to be their allies. Those armies were close enough to hear the gunfire. They did nothing. They waited. They let the city burn because helping was too risky, too expensive, too inconvenient. He changed the image. Another city, another time, another pile of bodies. This is Rwanda. 1994. 800,000 people killed in 100 days. The world watched. The world did nothing. Another image. Another tragedy. This is Syria. This is Bosnia. This is every time in our history when good people decided that helping was someone else's problem. Chun turned off the screen. He looked around the table at the faces of the council members. "We crawled out of the mud," he said quietly. "We survived ice ages and plagues and our own stupidity. We built rockets and reached for the stars. We joined the assembly and learned that the universe is vast and old, and full of species that have been doing this for millions of years, longer than us. And now we have a choice." He pointed toward the ceiling, toward the stars beyond. "Out there is a species that has never harmed anyone. They keep libraries. They record history. They asked for help, and the galaxy turned its back on them. We can do the same. We can be logical. We can be safe. We can become exactly like the Krethvok and the Orionists and all the others, who have decided that morality is less important than convenience." He lowered his hand. "Or we can be human." The room was silent for a long moment. Then the Secretary General spoke. "Admiral Chun, you are asking us to send our ships into a battle they cannot win. You are asking us to risk everything we have built." Chun nodded. "Yes, I am. Why?" Chun thought about the question. He thought about his grandfather, who had fought in wars that should never have happened. He thought about his daughter, who was serving on a patrol ship near the edge of human space. He thought about the Valorian children in those evacuation ships, waiting to die because no one cared enough to save them. Because if we do not, he said, then what was the point of any of it? What was the point of surviving all those years, all those wars, all those disasters? If we reach the stars and become just as cruel and selfish as every other species out there, then we have failed. We have become everything we always hated about ourselves. The vote was held 30 minutes later. It was close. 17 members voted against intervention. 18 abstained. 18 voted in favor. It was enough. The 7th Expeditionary Fleet received its orders the next morning. They were to proceed immediately to the Keth system. They were to protect the Valorian evacuation. They were to hold the line against the Hollow Swarm. They were not to expect reinforcements. Admiral Chun requested permission to command the mission personally. It was granted. As he boarded his flagship, the U.E.'s Defiance, he received a message from Commander Vasquez on Nexus Prime. The Assembly had learned of Earth's decision. The Krethvok were demanding an explanation. The Orionists were threatening economic sanctions. The Mirden had issued a formal statement of disapproval. Chun read the message and smiled. "Tell them," he replied, "that humanity sends its regards." 3 days later, the 7th Fleet entered hyperspace. They were 42 ships, 12,000 crew members, heading into a battle against billions of enemies. Every tactical analysis said they would lose. Every strategic projection said they would die. They went anyway. In her office on Nexus Prime, Ambassador Salathorn received the news from Vasquez personally. For a long moment, she did not speak. Her body flickered through colors that Vasquez had never seen before. Why? She finally asked. "You gain nothing from this. You risk everything." Vasquez thought about Chun's speech to the council. She thought about all the times in human history when people had stood up for strangers, when they had chosen what was right over what was safe. Because, she said, someone has to. The 7th Fleet emerged from hyperspace into a nightmare. Admiral Chun stood on the bridge of the Defiance and looked at the tactical display. The screen was supposed to show individual enemy contacts as red dots. Instead, it showed a solid wall of red that stretched across half the system. The computer could not count the individual swarm units. There were too many. It simply displayed a number that kept climbing. 1 billion, 2 billion, 3 billion. Around him, his crew stared at their screens in silence. They had known this would be bad. They had not known it would be this bad. "Well," said Captain Rodriguez, his second in command, "I guess we found them." Chun almost laughed. Rodriguez had served with him for 20 years. The man made jokes at funerals. It was his way of handling fear. "Signal all ships," Chun said. "Battle Formation Alpha. We are here to buy time for the evacuation, not to win the war. Our job is to hold the corridor open. Everything else is secondary." The fleet spread out into a defensive line. 42 ships against billions of enemies. It was insane. It was impossible. They did it anyway. The Hollow Swarm did not wait for them to finish. It came like a wave, like a storm, like nothing any human had ever seen. Individual swarm units were small, about the size of a ground vehicle, but they moved in perfect coordination. They did not need to communicate. They simply knew where to go and what to do. The same way a flock of birds knows how to fly together without crashing. The first wave hit the human line and broke against it like water against rock. Human weapons were crude by galactic standards, but they were powerful. Railguns threw metal slugs at a fraction of the speed of light. Missile batteries filled space with nuclear fire. Point defense lasers drew lines of light through the darkness. Swarm units died by the thousands, by the tens of thousands, by the hundreds of thousands. More came. Chun watched the battle unfold on his tactical display. The corridor behind the fleet, the path to the inner system where the Valorian evacuation ships were gathering, remained clear. That was what mattered. That was the only thing that mattered. "Admiral," his communications officer said, We are receiving a transmission from the Valorian government. They are asking how long we can hold. Chun looked at the numbers on his screen. He did the math in his head. It was not good math. Tell them 12 hours, he said. Maybe more if we are lucky. Sir, the evacuation will take at least 18 hours to complete. Chun nodded. I know. Tell them 12 hours. We will figure out the rest. The battle continued. Human ships took damage. The destroyer Wellington lost its engines and drifted out of formation, still firing its weapons until a swarm carrier crushed it against an asteroid. The cruiser Johannesburg held its position even as fires spread through its lower decks. Its captain, a woman named Okonkwo, refused to retreat until the flames reached her bridge. All hands abandon ship, she ordered calmly. It has been an honor serving with you. She stayed at her post while her crew escaped. The Johannesburg's reactor went critical 3 minutes later. The explosion took out 2 swarm carriers and bought the fleet. Another 20 minutes. Chun watched her ship die on his tactical display. He added her name to the list he was keeping in his head, the list of people he would never forget. The hours passed. The human line held, bent, broken places, reformed. Ships that should have been destroyed kept fighting. Crews that should have surrendered kept working. Pilots flew their damaged fighters into swarm formations because they had no missiles left and their guns were empty. And a ship moving at combat speed was itself a weapon. The swarm learned. It adapted. It sent units around the human line, trying to reach the evacuation corridor. Chun sent his fastest ships to intercept. They were destroyers, small and fragile, not designed for this kind of fight. They went anyway. Commander Torres of the destroyer Rapid led the interception force. His ship was already damaged, trailing atmosphere from a dozen holes in its hull. When he saw the swarm units heading for the refugee ships, he did not hesitate. All ships follow me, he said. We are going to make them remember us. His force cut through the swarm formation like a knife. They destroyed thousands of units. They lost 3 ships in 5 minutes. Torres kept going. A swarm carrier turned to face him. It was massive, the size of a small moon, a factory ship that could produce new units faster than his weapons could destroy them. Torres looked at it on his screen and made a decision. Navigation. Plot a collision course. His crew did not argue. They did not hesitate. They knew what he was asking, and they did it anyway. Signal the fleet, Torres said. Tell them it was a good run. The Rapid hit the carrier at full speed. The explosion was visible from Cath 7, a new star that burned for 3 seconds and then faded. When it was over, the carrier was gone. So was Torres and his crew. But the evacuation corridor was clear. Chun received a report on his bridge. His hands were shaking. He had known Torres for 15 years. He'd been at the man's wedding. Sir, his communications officer said, her voice unsteady, the Valorian evacuation ships are reporting that they have cleared the danger zone. They are heading for the inner system. Chun nodded. He looked at his tactical display. The 7th Fleet had started with 42 ships. He counted the survivors, 18. Less than half. And the battle was not over. How many civilians? He asked. 340 million, sir. Chun closed his eyes for a moment. 340 million lives. That was what Torres had died for. That was what all of them were dying for. Signal all ships, he said. We are not done yet. The swarm will try to pursue. We are going to make sure it cannot. The remains of the 7th Fleet turned to face the enemy once more. They were damaged, exhausted, running low on ammunition and hope. They fought anyway. The battle lasted 19 hours in total. When it was finally over, when the swarm had lost so many units that it could no longer maintain coordination and scattered into the void, only 17 human ships remained. 4,000 crew members had died. The Defiance itself was barely functional, held together by emergency repairs and the stubbornness of its crew. But the corridor was clear. The evacuation was complete. 340 million Valorians were safe on Nexus Prime. The Galactic Assembly watched the battle through long-range sensors. They had expected the humans to retreat after the first hour. They had expected surrender after the 5th. They had expected annihilation by the 10th dot instead. They watched the species they had dismissed as children stand against impossible odds and refused to break. The Krethvok ambassador watched the final hours of the battle in silence. When it was over, he turned to his aide. "What manner of species?" he asked quietly. "Fights like that?" His aide had no answer. None of them did. The Grand Chamber of the Galactic Assembly had never been so quiet. Every platform was occupied. Every delegation was present. Even the Mirthen, who usually avoided emotional situations, had descended from their high positions to watch. The chamber was designed to hold the voices of 10,000 species, but now no one spoke. They were all watching the Valorian platform. Ambassador Soleil Thorn stood at the front of her delegation. Her body glowed with steady silver light, the color of gratitude and wonder. Behind her, wearing a borrowed Valorian environmental suit because his own uniform was too damaged to wear, stood Admiral Marcus Chen. His left arm was in a regenerative cast. There was a healing burn across the side of his face. He had refused to leave his flagship until every surviving crew member was evacuated, and the last shuttle had barely escaped before the Defiance's life support failed completely. He looked tired. He looked old. He did not look defeated. Soleil Thorn spoke first. Her voice was soft, but the chamber's amplification systems carried it to every corner. 3 weeks ago, I stood in this chamber and begged for help. My people were dying. The Hollow Swarm was consuming our colonies, and there was nothing we could do to stop it. I asked the great powers of this assembly to honor their promises. I asked them to remember that we have been loyal members for 3,000 years. She paused. The chamber remained silent. You refused. The Krethvok were too busy. The Arenists calculated that we were not worth saving. The Mir then simply stopped listening. One by one, every delegation in this chamber turned away from us. You classified our extinction as an internal matter and went home to sleep. A light flickered, shifting towards something harder, something closer to anger. But one species did not turn away. One species, the youngest and smallest among us, looked at our suffering and decided that it could not stand by and watch. They sent their fleet into a battle they could not win. They sacrificed 4,000 of their people to save 340 million of mine. She turned to look at Chun. Why? She asked. You had no treaty with us. You had no economic interest in our survival. You gained nothing from your sacrifice. Why did you come? The question echoed through the chamber. Every eye, every sensor, every attention turned to the human Admiral Chun, looked around the room. He saw the Krethvok generals in their military uniforms, the same ones who had called his tactics suicidal. He saw the Orionist merchants already calculating how to profit from Valorian reconstruction contracts. He saw the Mirthen in their pods, watching him with ancient, unreadable eyes. He thought about what to say. He could give them a speech about human values. He could quote philosophers and poets. He could try to explain the complex history of his species. All the times they had failed, and all the times they had risen above their failures. Instead, he said something simple, because it was the right thing to do. For a moment, there was silence. Then the Krethvok ambassador rose from his seat. This is unacceptable, he declared. His voice rumbled through the chamber like thunder. The humans have violated assembly protocols. They have acted without authorization, interfered in the affairs of another member state, and destabilized regional security. We demand an immediate censure." The Orionis representative agreed. Military adventurism cannot be tolerated. If any species can simply deploy their fleet wherever they please, the entire structure of the assembly becomes meaningless. Other voices joined them. Accusations flew across the chamber. Some called the humans reckless. Others called them arrogant. A few suggested that their intervention had been a calculated move to gain influence, that they were no different from any other power seeking to expand their territory. Through it all, Chun stood quietly. He did not argue. He did not defend himself. He simply waited. When the noise finally died down, he spoke again. "You are right," he said. "We broke your rules. We acted without permission. We sent our ships into a fight that was not our concern, by your standards. And we lost good people doing it." He took a step forward, and something in his posture made the angry delegates fall silent. "But let me ask you something. What are your rules for? What is this assembly for? You say it exists to keep peace, to protect member species, to ensure that the galaxy remains stable and orderly. That sounds very noble. But when a peaceful species came to you begging for help, you did nothing. When billions of innocent people faced extinction, you calculated the cost and decided they were not worth saving." He pointed at the Krethvok delegation. "You have the largest military in the galaxy. You could have stopped the swarm before it reached the first colony. You chose not to." He pointed at the Orionis. "You control more wealth than most species can imagine. You could have funded a relief effort, hired mercenaries, done anything at all. You chose not to." He pointed at the Mirden. "You have been traveling the stars since before my species learned to make fire. You have knowledge and technology that could change everything. You chose to turn off your translators and pretend the problem did not exist." He lowered his hand. "You built an assembly to keep peace. But peace without justice is just comfortable silence while people suffer. You have power, all of you, more power than humanity will have for 1,000 years. And you use that power to do nothing." The chamber was silent again, but it was a different kind of silence now. Some delegations looked angry. Others looked uncomfortable. A few, from smaller species who had been watching quietly from the edges of the chamber, looked thoughtful. Chun turned to face them directly. The minor powers, the forgotten voices, the species who had never been important enough to matter. "We are not heroes," he said. "We are just a young species that made a choice. We saw people dying, and we decided we could not live with ourselves if we stood by and watched. That is all. If that makes us dangerous, if that threatens your stability, then maybe your stability was not worth protecting." He looked back at the great powers. "Censure us if you want. We will sleep fine." Salathorn stepped forward and stood beside him. Her light was burning bright now, brighter than anyone had ever seen from a Valorian. "The Valorian people will not forget what humanity has done," she said. "We will not forget that when the galaxy abandoned us, the humans stepped into the fire. And we will not forget that when the great powers of this assembly had the chance to act with honor, they chose to act with calculation instead." She looked around the chamber one final time. "We came here 3,000 years ago because we believed the assembly represented something noble. We are beginning to wonder if we were wrong." The session ended without a vote. The censure motion was tabled for later discussion. It would never be brought up again. As the delegations filed out of the chamber, something had changed. The great powers still controlled the galaxy, but their authority had cracked. A small species had shown that moral courage could exist without military might. And a young species had shown that military might could be used for something other than self-interest. It was not a revolution. Not yet, but it was beginning. And somewhere in the crowd, representatives from a dozen minor species made quiet note of the humans who had stood before the assembly and refused to apologize for doing what was right. They would remember. 3 years passed. The galaxy did not change overnight. The great powers still held their territories. The Krethvok still commanded the largest fleet. The Orionists still controlled the trade routes. The Mir then still watched from their ancient ships and said nothing useful. But something was different now. Something had shifted in ways that the old powers did not fully understand. Thought it started with the Valorians. After the evacuation, they had nowhere to go. Keth 7 was still being rebuilt, its surface scarred by the swarm's attack. Most of the survivors were living in temporary camps on nearby worlds, dependent on charity from species that had refused to help them when it mattered. Then the humans made an offer. They had a moon in the Sol system, a place called Titan, with vast underground caverns that had been prepared for colonization but never used. The Valorians were welcome to have it, not as guests, not as refugees, as permanent residents with full rights and full protection under Earth law. Ambassador Sally Thord traveled to Earth to accept the offer personally. She stood in the same council chamber where Admiral Chun had made his speech 3 years earlier, and she watched as human and Valorian officials signed the agreement together. "This is more than we deserve," she said afterward. Chun, now retired from active service but still consulted by the council, shook his head. "You deserve a home. Everyone deserves a home." The Valorians moved their great archives to Titan for the first time in 3,000 years. The collected knowledge of 10,000 civilizations was stored outside Valorian space. Human scholars came to study with Valorian alchemists. Valorian children learned human languages and human games and human stories about stubborn people who refused to give up. It was a small thing in the vast scale of the galaxy, but it mattered. Other changes followed. The species that had watched the assembly turn its back on the Valorians began to talk to each other. They were minor powers, most of them species without great fleets or vast territories. They had always been ignored by the Krethvok and exploited by the Orionists. But now they had something new, an example. They formed a loose coalition at first, just a communication network for sharing information and resources. They called themselves the Compact of Free Voices, and they made sure everyone knew that they were not aligned with any of the great powers. They were aligned with humanity. The great powers noticed, of course. The Krethvok sent diplomats to Earth to discuss mutual defense arrangements. The Orionists offered trade agreements with very favorable terms. The Mir then actually responded to human communications for the first time in decades. Elena Vasquez, now an admiral herself, received the Krethvok delegation in her office on Nexus Prime. She had moved from diplomatic observer to military commander after the Keth intervention. One of many humans whose careers had been transformed by those 19 hours of battle. The Krethvok ambassador explained his proposal carefully. The swarm was still out there, scattered but not destroyed. It would reform eventually. When it did, it would be larger and more dangerous than before. The Krethvok wanted humanity's help in preparing for that day. "You want our ships," Vasquez said. "We want your cooperation," the ambassador corrected. "Your tactics at Keth were effective. We wish to learn from them." Vasquez leaned back in her chair. She thought about what Chun had told her before he retired, about what it meant to be human in a galaxy that did not understand humanity at all. "I will tell you what we want," she said. "We want to help people. That is what we do. That is who we are. When someone comes to us in need, we answer. When someone is being hurt and we can stop it, we stop it. This is not negotiable. This is not a tactic. This is simply who we are." The ambassador shifted uncomfortably. "Such an approach is inefficient. It makes you vulnerable to exploitation." "Maybe. but it also makes us something the galaxy has never seen before. A species that can be trusted to do the right thing. Vasquez smiled. How much is that worth to you? The Krethvok signed a mutual defense treaty 2 months later. It was the first such agreement they had made with a species outside their own dominion in over 1,000 years. On Keth 7, reconstruction continued. The Valorians had returned to their homeworld, but it was not the same as before. Human engineers worked alongside Valorian architects. Human doctors treated patients in rebuilt hospitals. Human soldiers patrolled the orbital stations, their ships flying next to Valorian vessels that had never been designed for war, but were learning quickly. In the capital city, they built a memorial. It stood in the center of the main square, a simple pillar of black stone that reached toward the sky. On its surface, in every language used by the species of the Compact of Free Voices, were the names of the 4,000 humans who had died defending the evacuation corridor. At the base of the pillar, carved in the Valorian script that had recorded history for 3,000 years, was a single sentence. They stood in the fire for strangers. Admiral Chun visited the memorial near the end of his life. He was very old now, his body failing despite the best efforts of human and Valorian medicine. He had lived long enough to see humanity grow from a minor curiosity to a major influence in galactic affairs. He had lived long enough to see the Compact expand to include 30 species. He had lived long enough to watch his granddaughter graduate from the Joint Human-Valorian Academy on Titan. He stood before the pillar and read the names of the people he had led into battle. He remembered every one of them. He always would. A young Valorian girl approached him. Her skin flickered with the soft blue light of curiosity, and she looked up at him with wide eyes. "Are you one of the humans who saved us?" she asked. Chung looked down at her. He thought about Torres and Okonkwo and all the others who had given everything they had so that this child could exist. He thought about Rodriguez, who had survived the battle and now commanded his own fleet. He thought about Vasquez, who was building something new in the halls of power. He thought about all the humans who had come before him and all the ones who would come after. "We all are," he said quietly. "Every single one of us." The girl did not fully understand. She was too young. But someday she would read the histories. Someday she would learn about the day the assembly turned its back on her people and the day Estrange. Young species stepped into the fire to save them, and she would understand then what it meant to be human. Above them, ships from a dozen species patrolled the rebuilt orbital stations. The galaxy was vast and often cruel, and there were still powers out there that cared nothing for justice or mercy. The swarm was reforming somewhere in the darkness. Other threats would emerge. The future was uncertain, but humanity was no longer alone. The species that had once been dismissed as children had become something else, something the galaxy had never seen before. They had become a beacon, a promise, a reminder that courage and compassion were not weaknesses. And slowly, star by star, system by system, the galaxy was beginning to change. Not because humanity had conquered anything, not because they had made themselves rich or powerful, but because they had shown, in 19 hours of fire and sacrifice, that it was possible to choose what was right over what was safe. It was a lesson the galaxy would not forget. And somewhere, in the great archives of Titan, Valorian historians were already writing the story. They titled it simply, "The Day the Strangers Came." It would be read for 10,000 years.